Good morning, everyone. We are continuing our study of the book of Job. This morning, we're looking at the place of wisdom. So, we're getting towards the middle to end of Job, right? So, the book of Job, you start off with Job. You see at the beginning the behind the scenes between God and Satan over Job, right? And then you move on to Job, his lament in chapter 3. Then you get to the point where he's having that discussion with his friends back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? And he has this discussion with his friends, and his friends keep saying the same thing, saying that they say, you reap what you sow, which is true to a degree, but they're saying because bad things are happening to you, you must have deserved it, right? And they're incorrect in saying that, because we know from the very beginning of the book of Job, between God and Satan, that Job does not deserve what is befalling him. He did not deserve all this tragedy. And so Job's friends are trying to say, Job, you deserved it. And Job is trying to argue, I don't deserve this, right? Job's friends, and as you go through the book, as the discussion and the debate continues, Job's friends get more and more harsh, and Job becomes more and more, maybe defiant or insistent that he is innocent. Now, at the end of the book of Job, you have God coming to Job, right? And God talking to Job. Job will respond, and then God has more to say, right? And then you have the epilogue where Job goes on to live a happy life. But before you get to the end, so between the discussions between Job and Job's friend and the end of the book of Job where God comes to Job, there's two different breaks in there. There are two different things that occur. There's one in chapter 28 where Job starts talking about wisdom kind of out of nowhere. And then there's a fourth friend who comes in. And he only speaks one time, but he has several chapters worth of speaking. He's just got this monologue. And it's interesting as you read the book of Job because it's almost like these two different breaks are preparing you for the end of the book of Job when God comes in and he kind of sets everything right? So we're going to look at those two sections today, first in chapter 28, and then the second one's in chapter 32 to 37, but we won't go through the whole thing, right? So Job in chapter 28, and this is kind of out in the middle of nowhere. When you're reading the book of Job, chapter 28 sticks out like a sore thumb because you're like, how does this relate to anything? And then you get the fourth friend that comes along. Job and his three friends have been talking, but then a fourth friend comes along who's younger and he has more to say, and he takes a little bit more of a nuanced approach. And it's kind of preparing you for the end, right? These two sections, they're kind of preparing your mind for the right answer, right? Because Job doesn't have the right answer because he's saying, I'm innocent, I don't deserve this, God did something wrong. And then Job's friends are wrong because they're saying, no, God is punishing you. And they're both wrong. But then you have this chapter where Job talks about wisdom, and you're kind of left thinking, what does this have to do with everything else? And you don't really realize it until the end. And then you got Elihu, the fourth friend, who comes in, and he starts... he disagrees with Job, and he disagrees with Job's friends. And I think out of all the people in the book of Job, Elihu is probably the closest to being correct. I think he prepares you for the right answer. I don't think he has the right answer, but I think he's getting closer to it, if that makes sense. Okay, so let me go ahead and start with a prayer. Lord, thank you for the book of Job. It contains very difficult thoughts sometimes, and it's such an important book because there are so many people who are going to go through very similar things, whether it's ourselves or people we may know. Everyone goes through difficult suffering. Lord, help us to learn from this book. Help us to try to approach it with mature perspectives, to try to understand Job and Job's friends and try to glean where they're right and where they're wrong, and to and to get an appreciation of you. Help us to learn the principles in this book that, suffering is a very difficult topic, but ultimately the answer is to just serve you. And help us, Lord, to find peace in that. Thank you for this study. In your name, amen. So, the argument between Job and his friends kind of get pretty unproductive, right? Like I said, there's 3 cycles. Each of Job's friends will speak, and Job's going to reply to each, and that occurs 3 different times, right? So each friend gets to speak 3 times. The third one doesn't speak the third time. And Job speaks to each. And then here in chapter 28, this is kind of before Job has a big final defense. Job kind of responds to his friend, and then he's through chapter 27 to 31, he kind of gives his final defense, and he says, listen, I am innocent. I didn't deserve any of this, right? And so, but in the midst of that, there's this chapter 28 that feels out of place, and it's very much almost like a hymn or a song on the idea of wisdom, right? And you could ask the question, why in the middle of this debate between Job and his friends is Job just going to take an entire chapter to talk about wisdom and the importance of wisdom, right? What's the purpose there? And so we're going to have to ask the question, what does wisdom have to do with Job's problem? Right? This is kind of out of nowhere, and we have to ask ourselves this very important question. So we're going to read this chapter. So chapter 28 has some very important, crucial insights, right? He's going to start off by praising kind of the wisdom of humanity, the ingenuity, and he's going to talk about how humanity is able to do amazing things, and probably the number one thing he names is the ability to mine. Right? Humans are able to dig holes deep into caves and extract the minerals, right? But then he's going to say, well, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what humans can do, wisdom is inaccessible to humanity. He's going to say, we can't access wisdom. Then he's going to say, but the only person that truly has access to wisdom is God. And then at the end, he's going to define wisdom as fear of the Lord and serving him. Right? And so as we read this, again, think about how does wisdom factor into Job's story, right? So the first section is, like I said, he's focusing on human ingenuity. He's going to talk about how humans can uncover the hidden things of the earth, right? You don't see them, but you start digging, and you find these impressive minerals, silver, gold, iron, precious stone, how humanity is able to penetrate the darkness, explore the depths, reshape creation. And he's kind of just talking about how humans are able to master the physical world. So let's read that. Verse 1 to 11, it says, surely there is a mine for silver and a place for gold that they refine. Iron is taken out of the earth, and copper is smelted from the ore. Man puts an end to darkness and searches out to the farthest limit, the ore in gloom and deep darkness. He opens shafts in a valley away from where anyone lives. They are forgotten by travelers. They hang in the air. Far away from mankind, they swing to and fro. As for the earth, out of it comes bread, but underneath it, it is turned up as by fire. Its stones are the places of sapphires, and it has dust of gold. That path no bird of prey knows, and the falcon's eye has not seen it. The proud beast have not trodden it, the lion has not passed over it. Man puts his hand to the flinty rock and overturns mountains by the roots. He cuts out channels in the rocks, and his eye sees every precious thing. He dams up the streams so that they do not trickle, and the thing that is hidden he brings out to light. It's a beautiful section on how Job is just describing how humans are able to do things that no one else is able to do. I like where he says, a bird's not able to see what humans see. The beast, the lion, isn't able to dig into the ground. He's talking about, there's a place for silver, there's a place for gold. He's talking about, we're able to dig into the deepest depths, into the darkness, right? We're able to take it out to access the sapphires, access the dust of gold. No other animal is able to do this, right? He says, man is able to overturn mountains by its roots, right? He's just describing the incredible ingenuity of humanity, right? I think his point is saying humans are extremely wise. Humans are very, very wise. But then he said, oh, yeah, go ahead, Kevin. Yeah. If we want it, we can find it. That's a great point. If there's something to be found, if there's something valuable to be found, we're going to find it. And even if we have to turn a mountain upside down and dig all the way into the earth, we're going to get to it, right? But then he starts talking about wisdom and how humans can't access wisdom. So this is his next section where he says, humans, we can get whatever we want, but there's one thing outside of our grasp, and that's wisdom. He says, but where shall wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of living. The deep says, it is not in me, and the sea says, it is not with me. It cannot be bought for gold, and silver cannot be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, in precious onyx or sapphire. Gold and glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for jewels of fine gold. No mention shall be made of coral or of crystal. The price of wisdom is above pearls. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. So he says, we humans can get to anything, but here he's saying, but what about wisdom? He says, but where shall wisdom be found? He asked that twice. He's going to ask it in the next section as well. Where is the place of understanding? He says, we don't know its worth. We don't even understand how valuable it is. And, even if we did, we wouldn't be able to find it. He says the deep, the depths. Maybe he's talking about the sea twice. Maybe he's talking about the depths of the earth. Wisdom isn't found there. He says you can't buy it. It can't be bought for gold. It can't be weighed against silver. Right? Glass, gold, jewels, none of it compares to it. The topaz cannot equal it. Can't be valued in pure gold. So wisdom is far more valuable, but who can get to it? Right? And then he moves on to who actually has access to this wisdom? And his answer is God. Only God has access to wisdom, because really only God is the one who controls the world. He governs the world. He sees the things we do not. And so wisdom for him is just inseparable from God's sovereignty. Because God rules everything, he knows everything, right? From where then does wisdom come, and where is the place of understanding? That's the second time he said that. It is hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the air. Abaddon and Death say, we have heard a rumor of it with our ears. God understands the way to it, and he knows its place. For he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he gave to the wind its weight and appointed the waters by measure, when he made a decree for the rain and a way for the lightning of the thunder, then he saw it and declared it. He established it and searched it out. Right? So he asked that question a second time. Where does wisdom come? From where does wisdom come? Right? He's asking, where can you find wisdom? He mentions the birds in the air. The birds, in a sense, the birds are closest to heaven, right? Closest to the area that we cannot access, right? Because visually we often portray the heavens as above us. The birds who are able to look down and see everything that are the closest to heavens, even they don't understand. Even death, Abaddon is kind of the place of hell, the place of the grave. He says even hell and death, they only heard of a rumor about wisdom. Even death doesn't understand wisdom, but God understands it. He knows how to access it. He created the world by wisdom. Everything is in its place because God created it with wisdom. He didn't just create the world, He created it in an orderly manner that the world functions together. Whatever you're describing, whether you're talking about the winds, the waves, the rain, the lightning, the thunder, He established it. God only has access to wisdom. Then he ends with his last verse of saying, what is wisdom? Right? Wisdom is reverent obedience, not explanation. That humans are not given wisdom except for by God. If humans have any inkling of wisdom, it's only to serve God. He says, and he said to man, he said, God said to humans, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to turn away from evil is understanding. He said, he started off by saying, humans can access all these different things, but not wisdom. Only God can access wisdom. And then he says, wisdom is fearing God. Now, having read all of that, let's ask the question, what's the connection between Job's circumstance and wisdom? Yeah, Larry?
Well, I was answer that question. I was just thinking all the things that man can do doesn't mean that we need to do them.
That's a good point. Just because man can... Go ahead.
Wisdom is knowing the difference between what we should do and what would be acceptable to God and what isn't. Because there's a lot of things nowadays that's going on that we can do, but they're not necessarily for our good.
That's a great point. Man can do a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that they need to do it. And wisdom is knowing the difference.
I don't really know what to say about how to act or how to compare that to Job's.
Right.
Exactly.
How does that apply to Job? Yeah, Kim?
Job feels like he deserves an answer.
Mm-hmm.
And, I feel like in that there's a bit of pride.
Yeah, for sure. Job feels like he deserves an answer from God, and in that, there's a little bit of pride. And I would agree. I genuinely think that Job's sin in the book of Job is pride. I mean, was he innocent? And did he? Yes. What did he deserve? What he got? No. Was it a punishment? No. But to say, God, you owe me an answer, that's a prideful thing to say, isn't it? Right? So wisdom, let's say, what is wisdom? Wisdom is kind of knowing how things apply, being able to discern, being able to think, being able to make good decisions, to apply your knowledge correctly, to look at a situation and be able to figure out what's the problem and what's the solution, right? If we use Job's definition, wisdom is fearing God, understanding that God's in control, and that you should have this healthy, reverent respect to understand you don't want to be on God's bad side, and understanding that God has expectations of you and that you should abide by those expectations, right? So how does that apply to Job? Kevin? Mm-hmm.
God knows. Not only God knows, I'm waiting for to hear from him what's going on here.
That's a great point. Job is kind of telling his friends, you don't know what you're talking about. That's a great application where he says, because his friends, the entire book is trying to say, we know what God's doing, God's punishing you, right? The entire time. Which, just like what Kim said, that's a prideful thing to say, isn't it? There's one thing to say, God owes me an answer. That's prideful to say. But there's another thing to say, I know what's happening to you is God doing it. You don't actually know that. It's assumptive. You're making an assumption as if you can look into the spiritual reality and know, oh yeah, I know this conversation God had with Satan, and God was like, I'm so mad at Job, I'm going to punish him, and Satan's like, let's do it, or something along those lines. Right? Like that they don't know that. They're just making a giant assumption, right? And so Job might be saying this in the sense of, listen, humans are able to do a whole lot, but at the end of the day, you guys don't know what God's doing. You guys aren't wise, because humans aren't wise. Only God's wise, right? And that might be his way of saying to his friends, you don't know what you're talking about, right? But of course, at the other hand, can't we say that in reverse? Like with Job? Job doesn't know what he's talking about, right? You know, when Job says, God owes me an answer, no, he doesn't. In a sense, Job is defending himself and saying he's innocent, and yeah, he is innocent, but at a certain point, don't you think he should have reflected and asked himself, maybe did I deserve this? Or maybe he should have, because Job is a little bit guilty of what his friends are doing too, in that he's over-presumptive. He's saying something about God that he doesn't know. Job is the one who's saying God did something wrong here, right? And so everyone in this is trying to assume what God is doing, and yet Job's words kind of cut back on him, saying, Job, even you can't understand what God's doing, right? And so we're just the question of wisdom is, with Job, he's reached the limitations of wisdom. He doesn't. What is going on is beyond his understanding. He has no idea what's going on. Neither do his friends. They just don't, right? And so it becomes very difficult, and you'll experience this in your life. Maybe you probably already have. When your wisdom conflicts with God's wisdom. When what happens in reality, what God does, what God permits, what life is doing, goes against what you think should be done, right? There are difficult times whenever your wisdom and God's wisdom aren't in harmony, and that leads you to ask, God, what are you doing? And you're confused and you're doubting. Job, at this point in his life, because he's reached the limitations of his own wisdom, because whatever's happening is beyond his understanding, he has to make the difficult decision to abandon his own wisdom and trust in God's wisdom, right? Because in this instance, he's saying, I deserve an answer. God, explain to me your wisdom right here. Explain to me what you're thinking. But the answer Job was supposed to have is to say, I don't need an answer, to say, I trust that God is wise and knows what he's doing, right? Because if God is the only one who has access to wisdom, then you should trust whatever he does. If God is doing something wise, and he's always wise, and he's always doing wise things, whatever he does is wise, then even whenever it affects you in a terrible way, you should still trust him, right? And this is I think in the book of Job, we read this because it's all the book. The writer is almost preparing us for that idea that, okay, only God has wisdom, and Job's thought is, if God has wisdom, he needs to explain it to me. But that's not the answer. God has wisdom, so you need to trust him. Shirley?
It's pretty, we do the same thing, I'm sure. Something's going on. Why is this happening to me? I don't know. That's arrogant.
Yeah.
That's just downright arrogant. Because God is always for us in a good way. It may not seem like it, but there's good that comes from it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's things we don't know.
Exactly. There are things we don't know. And part of God being wise is understanding the big picture. And we don't. I see my life, and I don't even see all of my life because I forget about things or things that have happened to me that I don't even realize. My powers of observation are not perfect, all right? My powers of understanding are not perfect. So I barely even have a piece of my life in my brain. God, he understands it all. If he was able to put the thunder where it's supposed to go, the lightning where it's supposed to go, the winds and the waves, he understands everything. That's why he's the most wise, because he knows everything, he's in control of everything. And look at the results. The world is not falling apart in the sense of, the birds aren't falling out of the sky, the mountains are holding together, gravity's still working, He made this world in a very good way. So whenever he acts in your life, you have to trust that he's doing the same, that he knows what he's doing, and that it's a good decision. So whenever you are kind of like, what's God doing? You have to fall back on that instinct of, God's good, God's wise, I trust in him. Easier said than done, granted. It took Job a little bit, took Job quite a bit, when you're in Job's situation, I'm not saying it's good, I do expect you to go through this kind of trial where you're like, man, what is God doing? That's a natural question to ask. But the answer is, God knows what he's doing. He's wise. Trust in him. Kim?
I know that you have already talked about grief in the class, but in the grief shared classes that I went through, Job is a big part of our study too, because whatever happens to our loved ones, we ask God why, and we do think we know better, but when we're asking that, we're not really ourselves.
Yeah.
We are grieving, and so Job is grieving too.
Mm-hmm.
Job is grieving. He's not really himself. He feels like he deserves an answer.
Agreed.
To why, but none of us deserve an answer to why.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to trust God.
Yep.
And that's what we learn from the book of Job.
Yep. That's the answer with Job. It's not about why you suffer, it's about how you respond and trusting in him. And you're absolutely right. Job really isn't himself right now. After this happens, I don't know. How can you be yourself after this happens? He's not thinking rationally, and I'm sure that years down the road, he would think to himself, yeah, I wasn't being myself, and I shouldn't have been saying all those things, right? But in the heat of the moment, certainly, we need to recognize when we say why. When we ask the question, why are you doing this, God, even that itself is rooted in a little bit of a, I know better, because you don't ask God, why are you doing what you're doing, when he does what you expect him to do. But when he does something that you don't expect him to do and you're asking why, it is a natural question. I think it's good to ask the question because then you start the process of realizing, okay, he knows better than you. But whenever you ask the question why, it's because what God's wisdom is not on the same page as your wisdom, right? You're not on the same page with God, right? And that is an opportunity for you to get on the same page with God, to get on his page, to understand, okay, what I think would be better to do in this scenario, what I think God should have done is not the right thing, because God always does the right thing. And so whatever God did or does, that's the right thing to do, and I have to trust that it's the right thing, even when I don't have all the answers, even whenever I don't see everything that's happening, right? Even whenever I don't see all the pieces, right? And so this is just, wisdom is going to be really important because it's going to prepare us for the ending of the book when God comes to Job and he says, look at everything that I've created. I have all this power. I know all of this stuff. And Job has to step back and say, you know what? It's over my head, right? That's kind of what he says at the end. It's too marvelous for me. So I think chapter 28 is really kind of a break from the arguing and the discussions and the debate to get us to understand, just for a moment, Job hits on the key issue of wisdom, right? Human wisdom versus God's wisdom, right? That our human wisdom is less than God's wisdom, and so you got to trust God's wisdom when you reach the limit of your wisdom, right? So the second thing we're going to cover today, Elihu. Elihu is the fourth friend, and he has some, I love reading Elihu. I think he says things very beautifully. Elihu is younger. He says at the beginning, listen, I didn't say anything because I wanted the older people to speak, but I have to say something. He feels this anger. And, Job and his friends would go back and forth, but Elihu just gets one big monologue, chapter 32 to 37. And he says some of my favorite verses, right, whenever he describes how amazing God is. Elihu, out of everyone in the book, is the closest to being right. I think he's still presumptive, and he assumes that you can know what God is doing, right, which you can't always. He disagrees with Job's friends. Elihu actually says, my friends who say you're guilty are wrong. He says he doesn't think Job is actually guilty. He doesn't think Job actually deserves what he's getting, right? Which in the book is refreshing. You're like, finally a guy who sees that Job isn't guilty. But Elihu says, Job, what you're saying is wrong. I don't think you deserve everything that happened, but what you're saying is wrong. You shouldn't be saying God owes you an answer, right? And I think he's right in saying that. I think Elihu is the closest person to being right, and I think just the way the book is structured, I think reading Elihu really gets your mind ready for when God comes on the scene, right? Elihu kind of sees himself as someone who's going to come and kind of help everyone figure out what the right answer is. Like he wants to cause peace and just say, okay, both of you guys are wrong, sit down, let me explain. Right? And he's a little presumptive in doing that, but I think, like I said, I think he's the closest person to being right in the book. So this is kind of what, we're not going to read all of this, but I have pieces I want to read. So he talks about, he says, okay, this is why I'm speaking, because I'm just so angry and just kind of, I'm like, I got to say something. I think you guys are all wrong. Then he starts explaining, like, he sees suffering as God speaking to us, which I certainly think that's part of suffering. Let me make a small note while we're talking about suffering. There is not one single answer about suffering, right? It's not as if all suffering is punishment, right? It's not as if there's one answer. When you suffer, it's always this one thing. I think there are a multitude of factors, right? And Elihu is the only one who kind of sees that. You know, Job's asking, why am I suffering? Job's friends are saying, you're suffering because you're being punished. Elihu says, actually, there are multiple things that God can do through suffering. Sometimes you suffer because of this. Sometimes you suffer because of this, right? And so one of the big things he says is God's trying to speak to you through the difficulties in your life. He talks about justice. He talks about how humans are accountable to God. He talks about human limitation, how God is so much bigger than us. He talks about God's instruction, how God teaches us through the difficulties in life. He talks about how God is so majestic in his creation, reveals how incredible he is. And he calls Job to be silent. You know, he doesn't say to Job, you got to repent. You have done evil. He says, Job, I think you need to sit still, quit speaking, and just listen to God, which is the best answer that any of the friends have given so far, right? So a little bit of what he goes through. So whenever he starts speaking, he says, I am angry for two reasons. The first reason is Job is justifying himself rather than God. The second reason is Job's friends are condemning Job really without an answer. They're saying Job is guilty, but they're not able to name a reason why he's guilty, right? So again, he starts off saying Job's wrong and Job's friends are wrong, right? So reading the first couple of verses that he says, right? So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. So then Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. And I think that's an important statement. We'll come back to that. He burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he burned with anger. All right, so he's the young, passionate guy. And it says something that the young guy in the book has the most wisdom. It's the opposite of what you would expect in the book of Job. It's the opposite of what you expect just in life, but sometimes that happens, right? Usually wisdom comes with experience, but not always, right? So Job justified himself rather than God. This is what Elihu says. Behold, in this you are not right. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend against him, saying he will answer none of man's words? Why is it, what does it mean to justify yourself rather than God? So to justify, Kim, go ahead.
It's just looking at your things that you are doing in life and using human wisdom,
Justifying yourself, yep. Using the human wisdom. I mean, the word justify means you declare someone innocent. So Job is declaring himself innocent instead of God. Elihu doesn't say Job is a secret sinner, doesn't say he's morally or wickedly corrupt, but he he says that Job is more insistent of his own innocence than he is God's innocence. So, God is always innocent, right? God can do no wrong. And then when you're living your life and you're serving God, you're innocent, right? You're not doing anything wrong for the most part. I think we all know from the New Testament perspective, we're all sinners. But Job here, he's so insistent that I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, but he never says God's innocent. Instead, he says rather the opposite. And that's what Elihu can't stand. He says, you think you're more innocent than God. You think you are better than God in a way, because he's saying, I'm good, I've done nothing wrong, but God has done something wrong. He's saying, you are saying that God is wrong and you're right. Isn't that a bad thing to say? Right? And so, I mean, is Elihu right in saying, Job, what you're saying God's wrong, right? Right? Elihu is really pointing out the biggest mistake Job makes. Job is an awesome guy. I mean, it takes a lot for the book of, for God's word to say you're righteous, right? When God says you're righteous, you are righteous. But Job is almost acting like he is better than God by saying God has done something wrong and I haven't, right? And on top of that, when he says, I've done nothing wrong, but God has done something wrong, he's then saying, God owes me an answer. Just because Job has done nothing wrong, and it may feel like and look like God has done something wrong. He didn't, but it looks like it. Doesn't mean Job has authority over God. Even if God did something wrong, and he hasn't, that doesn't mean God owes you an answer. Right? There are going to be times whenever you ask God for an answer. There are going to be times whenever you're just confused and you say, God, what's going on? And that's okay to ask. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you start saying, God owes me an answer, that's when you've crossed the line, haven't you? Right? It's that attitude. It's the attitudes that's the difference. When you come to him as a father, a child to a father, and say, God, I don't understand. If you could reveal it to me, that would help me a lot. But whenever you have this attitude of saying, God, you know I didn't do anything wrong. You've done something wrong. Explain it to me. You've crossed the line there, right? And that's what Elihu is pointing out about Job. And I think it is extremely, extremely accurate. You know, the end of the book of Job, God criticizes the three friends and says they were wrong. God does not say Elihu was wrong. God also doesn't say Elihu was right, but he doesn't say Elihu was wrong, and he didn't say Elihu needed to repent. He said the three friends needed to repent. So I think it's important to note that I think Elihu is absolutely right here, 100% correct, in that there's nothing wrong with saying, why God, but don't demand an answer and don't say he did something wrong, right? Shirley, did I see your hand?
Well, I was just thinking, like, he had the right attitude.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't saying it in a bad way. He was just pointing out,
Mm-hmm.
this is what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So his attitude was wrong.
Yeah, I think if there's anyone in the book we should emulate when it comes to the tragedy, Elihu does really good because he's just like, okay, Job, I know you might not be wrong, you might not have deserved this, but you got to be careful what you say. And that's true. Now, I will say Elihu does something wrong in that, he starts talking about, and I'll finish real quick. He starts talking about, okay, well, we suffer for these reasons. Sometimes we suffer because it's preventative. Sometimes God will put difficulty in our life to keep us from going into sin. He says sometimes suffering is corrective. Sometimes God will put difficult things in our life to help us change the way we're behaving. And he says sometimes it's to instruct us. Sometimes God puts difficult things in our lives to teach us, right? And that's more nuanced than than any of the other friends when he says, when you suffer, it's not just one thing. Sometimes it's preventative, corrective, or instructive. And he's right saying that there are multiple causes for difficult things in your life. But he acts like when bad things happen in your life, if you just think about it and you think clearly, you'll be able to figure out what God's doing. And he's wrong there. He kind of acts like, you'll be able to figure out what God's doing. Job, just think hard enough. Think clearly. Let's talk about this. We'll figure out why all your children died. No. Because at the end of the book of Job doesn't get an answer. There are going to be times when we suffer, and you don't get an answer. But you can say, well, it could be for this reason, or this reason, or this reason, but you're not going to get an answer. So Elihu was right in his nuanced approach, but even then, Elihu is still trying to reason the suffering. He's trying to explain the suffering. He's trying to figure out a reason why this bad thing has happened to this good person. But the true answer, which God is going to come in and give, the true answer is not an answer or an explanation. The answer is trust him. So even there, Elihu is not quite 100% correct. Okay, so next week we are going to go to the end, towards the end when God shows up towards Job, and we're going to spend a couple of weeks on that interaction because God's going to start talking about his power, his wisdom, and Job's going to finally be quiet. All right, that's what we'll cover next week. Hope you guys are having a good morning.